Snow fell in a slow, relentless hush that swallowed sound and time alike. The mountains loomed in the dark like sleeping beasts, and the wind cut through the trees in long, mournful sighs. Alexander Hale gripped the steering wheel of his Range Rover tighter as he drove up the narrow road toward Hale Ridge Resort. The headlights carved two pale tunnels through the storm. He had not meant to come here tonight. The resort was closed for the season, its grand windows dark, its halls empty. But the storm had grounded his flight in Aspen and forced him back to the one place he had spent years avoiding. It was the last place his wife had been alive. He parked in front of the main building, its facade a blur of white and shadow. The key card still worked. Inside the lobby, the silence was thick enough to hear his own breath. The fire pit in the center had long gone cold, but the scent of cedar still clung to the air. He shook the snow from his coat, poured himself a small measure of scotch from the bar, and let the heat slide down his throat. The light flickered from the emergency generator, making the gold and marble of the room look like an abandoned cathedral. He stood by the window, watching the snow sweep sideways across the glass when he heard it. A faint sound, not the creak of wood or the sigh of wind, but something softer, more human. He frowned, setting his glass down, and listened again. There it was, a muffled thud, and then a small cough echoing from the staff corridor behind the kitchen. Every instinct told him to ignore it, but something pulled him forward. The corridor lights flickered as he walked. At the end of the hallway, one door stood ajar, letting out a thin line of yellow light. He pushed it open gently. The sight that met him stopped him cold. A woman stood in the middle of the small room, clutching a child to her chest. Her hair was damp, her uniform wrinkled. Her bare feet red from cold. The child slept heavy against her shoulder, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. The woman's eyes were wide, her breath quick and shallow. "Please do not come inside." She whispered the words, breaking between fear and exhaustion. Alexander froze his hand, still on the door. "I am sorry, I did not mean to frighten you," he said, his voice low, steady. She shook her head, tightening her hold on the child. "We will leave when the storm stops. I promise, please just close the door." He looked around the room. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the nightstand beside a small duffel bag. A stuffed bunny lay on the bed, its ear torn. She was not stealing, she was hiding. The heater was off the window, cracked open, letting flakes of snow drift in. "You will freeze to death," he said. She lifted her chin as if daring him to believe otherwise. "We will manage," she murmured. He could see now that her fear was not of him, but of something much larger. The kind of fear that lived in the bones long after the danger was gone. He took a step back, keeping his distance. "What is your name?" he asked. "Clara," she answered softly. "And this is Luna." Alexander nodded slowly. "Clara, you are safe here for tonight." She gave a brittle laugh, one that carried no amusement. "Safe is not a real thing anymore, Mr. Hale." He hesitated, hearing his name on her lips. The emergency lights flickered again, and for a brief second the room went dark. When the power returned, he saw her silhouette against the snow-filled window. She looked like someone carved from quiet defiance and grief. He could have called security or sent her away, but something in her voice, something in the tremor of her hands stopped him. He knew what it was like to hold on to the last thing you loved and be too afraid to let go. The child stirred, whimpering in her sleep. Clara hushed her gently, swaying slightly, her eyes never leaving him. "Please," she whispered again, this time softer, almost pleading. "Please do not come inside." He exhaled a slow breath, then shrugged off his coat and set it on the chair by the door. "For the night," he said. She blinked confused as he turned to leave. "You can lock the door from inside," he added without looking back. He walked down the corridor, his footsteps echoing faintly until the sound was swallowed by the storm. Back in the lobby, he poured another measure of scotch, but the warmth did not reach him. He kept seeing her eyes, that mix of fear and strength, the way she held the child as if her arms were the only thing keeping the world from breaking apart. Outside, the storm raged harder, and the world beyond the glass disappeared completely. Inside the great empty resort, a single light burned behind a closed door. Alexander Hale stood alone, with the taste of regret on his tongue and the echo of her voice in his mind. "Please do not come inside." He told himself he had done the right thing, that she was just another stranger caught in the storm. But as the night deepened and the wind screamed through the valley, he could not shake the feeling that something in him had shifted. For the first time in years, he had wanted to stay. Morning crept into the mountains quietly, a faint blue light slipping through the heavy clouds that still clung to the peaks. The storm had softened, but not ended, leaving the resort buried under a deep, blinding white. In the staff room, Clara Jennings stirred at the faint hum of the generator. Her first thought was of Luna, still asleep beside her, her small hand resting over the stuffed bunny she refused to let go of. The room was cold, her breath visible. When she sat up, she saw something by the door, a thermos of coffee still steaming, and a folded note written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "You are safe here. Do not worry about the storm." Clara stared at it for a long time before picking it up. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and scotch. She pressed it against her chest for a second, unsure why the gesture made her eyes sting. She told herself it was exhaustion. The sound of Luna's breathing grounded her back to reality. She could not afford to trust anyone, especially a man like him. Wealthy men always had motives. Yet something about his eyes last night, gray distant, not cruel, had unsettled her certainty. When she finally opened the thermos, the rich scent of coffee filled the room. She poured a little into a paper cup and let it warm her hands. Luna stirred awake, blinking sleepily. "Mama, did it stop snowing?" "Not yet, sweetheart," Clara said softly. "We will wait a little longer, then we will go." Luna nodded, nestling closer. Her innocence was a fragile mercy in a world that had shown Clara only hardness. When she looked out the frosted window, she saw only swirling white. No road, no paths, no escape yet. Somewhere upstairs she heard the faint sound of footsteps, the measured, steady rhythm of a man used to walking through silence. She knew it was him. Upstairs, Alexander Hale stood at the window of his private suite, looking down at the courtyard. Snow lay in sculpted drifts across the glass roof of the atrium. He could see the faint trail of his own footprints from last night, already half buried. He thought of the woman below, the way she had held the child, as if the world depended on her grip. He had meant to sleep, but the storm and her voice kept him awake. He poured black coffee into a porcelain cup and tried to steady his thoughts. It had been 2 years since the crash, 2 years since the sky betrayed him. He had flown that plane himself, his wife beside him, laughter in her voice, until the engine died mid-air. He had survived. She had not. Everyone called it mechanical failure, but he knew the truth. He had ignored the warning light. Guilt had wrapped around his soul like frost, and he had never truly thawed. He managed his empire by instinct, not desire. Money had become the simplest way to avoid feeling. Until last night. Something about the way she said please had pierced through the armor. By noon, the snow turned heavier again. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her phone. No signal, no map, no news, just isolation. She told herself she was fine. She always survived. When Luna fell asleep again, Clara moved to the mirror and caught her own reflection. Hollow Eye's hair tangled a faint bruise along her wrist, from where her husband had grabbed her last month. The restraining order was just paper. Paper could not stop fists. She touched the bruise, then let her hand fall. A knock came on the door, light, respectful, but firm. Clara froze. Her pulse spiked. "It's me," Alexander's voice said from the other side, calm but low enough not to wake the child. She hesitated, her mind racing through every possibility. What if he called the police? What if he wanted her gone? She opened the door halfway. He stood there unshaven, wearing a gray sweater and jeans. His presence filled the narrow space like quiet gravity. "I brought food," he said, holding a tray. "The kitchens still have some supplies, bread, soup, fruit." Her stomach betrayed her with a low rumble. "You do not have to," she murmured. "I do not," he agreed, "but I want to." He set the tray on the small table and stepped back. His restraint disarmed her more than his kindness. He did not cross the threshold. The warmth of the soup filled the air. She broke the bread and handed a piece to Luna, who woke to the smell and smiled shyly. Alexander smiled back just faintly. He had not realized how much he missed the sound of a child's laughter. Later, as the afternoon dimmed into gray, Clara found herself looking toward the hallway, listening for his steps. It unnerved her. Men had always been storms in her life, loud, destructive, impossible to predict. But this man's silence was different. It did not demand or invade. It waited. She remembered the coat he had left last night. It hung now over the chair, far too large for her, but she had draped it around Luna when the child grew cold. When she lifted it earlier, something fell from the pocket, a photograph. A woman with dark hair and laughing eyes standing beside a small plane. On the back, written in ink, now slightly smudged. "To Alex, my favorite co-pilot. Love, Elise." Clara set it back quietly. She understood grief when she saw it. That evening, the storm intensified again. The walls creaked under the weight of wind. Clara sat by the small heater, watching Luna sleep. Her thoughts drifted to the man upstairs. She had promised herself never to depend on anyone again, but tonight the mountain felt endless and cruel. When a faint knock sounded again, she did not move. The door opened an inch enough for his voice to carry through. "The roads are closed. The storm is worsening. Stay near the main building in case of emergency." She swallowed, unsure if it was fear or gratitude she felt. "Thank you," she said quietly. His reply came softer than before. "Get some rest, Clara. Tomorrow might be worse." The door closed again, and she was left with the echo of his footsteps. For a long time she sat motionless, the sound of the blizzard filling the silence. Then she looked at Luna, peaceful in sleep, and whispered a truth she could not speak to anyone else. "Maybe we are not meant to run forever." Upstairs, Alexander lay awake on the couch, the photograph of his wife on the table beside him. Outside the window, Snow danced like ghosts in the wind. He thought of the woman hiding below, of her strength, her fragility, and how both somehow mirrored his own. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing. He was no longer alone in this storm. By dawn, the storm had turned from a passing threat into a siege. Snow had buried the road, completely, drifts rising against the resort's doors like frozen waves. The world beyond Hale Ridge had disappeared, replaced by white silence and the low hum of the failing generator. Alexander Hale stood in the lobby, staring at the flickering lights on the control panel. The emergency system would last another 24 hours at most. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, feeling the scrape of stubble, and told himself he was not worried. Yet when his thoughts drifted to the small staff room down the hall, the unease in his chest deepened. She was still there, Clara Jennings, the woman who had whispered at him through fear, "Please do not come inside." He had not gone back since leaving her that note, but he had thought about her all night, about her quiet defiance, the way she had shielded the child without hesitation, and the faint tremor in her voice that sounded too familiar to ignore. He remembered what it felt like to hold the world together by sheer will, and to know you were one wrong breath from breaking. Upstairs, the pipes groaned as heat faltered through the system. He knew what had to be done. Without power, the smaller rooms would freeze first. He set a pot of water on the old wood stove in the lounge and added logs until the flames caught. The smell of burning pine filled the air. For the first time in years, the resort felt almost alive again. He poured 2 mugs of tea and carried one down the hall. When he knocked this time, there was a pause before the latch clicked open. Clara stood framed in the doorway, Luna beside her, clutching the stuffed bunny. The faint color had returned to their cheeks, but her eyes were guarded. "You need to move upstairs," he said simply. "The heat will not hold here." She hesitated. "We do not want to cause trouble. You will cause less trouble alive," he replied. For a second, her lips parted as if she might argue. Then she nodded and began gathering their things. He watched as she helped the little girl into a coat far too thin for the cold. The child looked up at him shyly. "Are you the boss?" she asked. Something like a smile tugged at his mouth. "Sometimes," he said, "but not always." They followed him through the dim corridors into the main lounge where the fire glowed faintly. Clara stopped just inside the threshold, her breath catching at the sight of the vast room with its tall windows now rimed with frost. The light from the fire played over the polished wood and the faded portraits of travelers long gone. It felt like stepping into another world. "You can stay here by the fire," Alexander said. "The kitchen is through there. I will check the backup fuel." Clara's instinct was to refuse his help, but Luna ran straight to the warmth and held out her hand, sighing with contentment. Clara's resistance softened. "Thank you," she said finally. He gave a short nod and left her to settle. Hours passed. The storm showed no mercy. Wind howled through the chimneys, and snow piled higher against the doors. The generator coughed and dimmed, then caught again. Clara found herself sitting on the floor with Luna, wrapped in a blanket beside her, watching the firelight dance. It had been years since she had allowed herself a moment of stillness. Her life had been motion, running, hiding, surviving. Now there was nowhere to go. She stared at the flames until her thoughts blurred the heat, lulling her into uneasy calm. Alexander returned with a bundle of candles and extra blankets. He set them near the hearth. "We may be here for days," he said quietly. She looked up, startled. "Days?" "The roads are impassable," he confirmed. "I sent a message from the emergency line, but no response yet. The valley loses signal during heavy snow." He saw the flicker of panic cross her face and added gently, "You are safe here, Clara. No one can reach us for now." His reassurance should have frightened her, but instead it loosened something inside her. As evening fell, they shared soup heated over the fire. Luna fell asleep, quickly curled in the chair with the stuffed bunny. Clara sipped her tea and tried not to watch Alexander as he leaned back against the hearth. The firelight softened him, revealing the exhaustion beneath his composure. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man who had been lost too long. She found herself speaking before she meant to. "How did you end up here?" she asked. He glanced toward the window, where snow pressed against the glass. "Wrong turn, maybe, or maybe I wanted to remember what I tried to forget." She studied him. "Your wife." His jaw tightened. "You read the photo," he said after a moment. It was not a question. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to pry." He shook his head. "I left it there. Maybe I wanted someone to ask." For a long time, neither spoke. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Finally, he said, "I was flying that night. Small plane, clear skies, nothing wrong until there was. She trusted me completely. She always did. I thought I could save her, but the storm was stronger." He looked into the fire as if searching for something he had lost in the flames. "I have not flown since." Clara felt the weight of his confession settle between them like falling ash. She understood the language of guilt too well. She had spoken it in whispers to herself every night since she left her husband. Maybe guilt was just another kind of prison built from what-ifs and maybes. "You survived," she said softly. "Sometimes surviving feels like the punishment," he replied. She turned her gaze to Luna. "For me, it is the reward. For her, I would survive anything." Their eyes met across the firelight, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition perhaps, or quiet respect. It was not attraction, not yet. It was the fragile understanding that came when two people saw their own brokenness reflected back. Later that night, the wind screamed through the mountains, and the lights flickered again. Clara moved closer to the fire, shivering. Alexander reached for another log, and she noticed the tremor in his hand. Without thinking, she said, "You are shaking." He froze, then laughed softly. "I guess even billionaires get cold." She smiled for the first time, a real smile that made her eyes shine. The warmth spread between them slowly, like thawing ice. For the first time since she arrived, she felt something close to peace. The storm outside could rage all it wanted. Inside the resort, the fire burned steady, and two strangers sat in silence, not as captor and guest, but as two souls caught in the same winter. When she finally drifted to sleep, the last thing Clara saw was Alexander sitting by the window, staring into the snow, as if trying to read its secrets. Upstairs in his thoughts, he repeated her words again. "You are shaking." No one had said it with concern in years. He realized how long it had been since anyone had cared enough to notice. Outside the storm stayed. Inside, something fragile began to live again. Morning broke gray and heavy over the mountains. The snow had stopped falling, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the storm itself. The resort stood buried to the windowsills, the world outside wrapped in white, so deep it seemed time had stopped. Inside, the fire in the lounge had burned down to embers, casting a dull orange glow across the floor where Clara sat with a mug of coffee between her hands. She had not slept much. The quiet was almost too much to bear after years of running and hiding, as if peace itself had become a stranger she did not know how to greet. Across the room, Alexander Hale stood by the window, one hand resting on the frost-rimmed glass. He looked like a figure carved out of the mountain itself, tall and still and distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "The radio says the roads are blocked for at least another 2 days. Crews can't get through until the wind settles." Clara nodded, trying not to let the anxiety show. 2 more days meant 2 more nights of waiting, of wondering if the world she had escaped might find her again. Luna played quietly, near the hearth, humming to herself, building a small fort from couch cushions and blankets. Alexander watched her for a moment before saying softly, "Kids have a way of making anywhere feel less empty." Clara managed a faint smile. "She does that. She's the reason I'm still here." He nodded, as if he understood completely. He turned from the window and poured himself another cup of coffee. For a while they existed in a fragile rhythm of silence, the kind that held the weight of unspoken things. Clara glanced at him once, noticing the way his shoulders seemed perpetually tense, like a man carrying something too heavy for too long. Finally, she broke the quiet. "You said last night the storm was stronger." "What did you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the fireplace and crouched down, adding another log to the flames. Sparks leapt up, painting his face in fleeting gold. When he finally spoke, it was as if the words had been waiting for years. "I used to fly," he said quietly. "Small planes mostly. It was how I met Elise, my wife. We built this resort together. She loved the mountains. She said they reminded her of what was still wild in the world." He gave a small, almost fond smile that died quickly. 2 winters ago, we took off from Aspen. Clear sky, perfect weather. Then the wind shifted. I thought I could outrun the storm. I was wrong." His voice thinned. "I tried to bring us down on the lake. The ice cracked on impact. She didn't make it out. I did." Clara's breath caught. She wanted to say something, anything, but no words seemed enough. The silence that followed was the kind that held grief inside it, like breath held too long. Finally, she said softly, "You blamed yourself." He gave a humorless laugh. "Blamed implies I stopped at some point. After that, I stopped flying, stopped everything really. I let my managers run the business. I moved into an apartment in the city, but I never unpacked. Coming here now was a mistake. This place is a grave that looks like a hotel." Clara set her mug down. Her hands trembled slightly. She knew that kind of guilt, the kind that gnawed from the inside out, until even the simplest things felt undeserved. "My husband used to fly too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but only with anger. Alexander looked at her, then truly looked. She drew a slow breath and continued. "He had a temper, the kind that always needed a target. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought it would change him. It didn't. It just gave him another weapon." Her eyes stayed on the fire as she spoke. "The first time he hit me, I told myself it was fear. The second time, I told myself it was love. By the 5th time, I stopped telling myself anything at all. I left after he threw a chair near Luna. The police gave me a restraining order, but paper burns faster than skin. So I ran." She forced a small smile. "I've been running ever since." The confession hung between them, fragile and raw. Alexander wanted to say he was sorry, but the words felt useless. Instead, he said quietly, "You survived. Sometimes that is the bravest thing." She shook her head. Surviving isn't the same as living. Living means trusting again, sleeping without fear, believing the world won't collapse when you close your eyes. I don't know if I can ever do that again. He looked at her across the firelight, the pain in her words carving something open inside him. Maybe you're not supposed to yet. Maybe it starts smaller, a breath without flinching, a meal without fear. He paused. Maybe it starts with coffee that someone else made. She met his gaze, and for a brief second, warmth flickered through the cold space between them. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it was recognition. The day stretched long and gray. They worked together to keep the fire burning melting snow, for water when the generator sputtered out. Alexander showed Luna how to toast bread on a stick over the flames. The little girl laughed, her giggles echoing softly in the vast lounge. Clara watched from the sofa, something fragile stirring inside her chest. She had forgotten what laughter sounded like when it wasn't forced. Alexander glanced at her, once catching the flicker of softness in her eyes, and something in him thawed. He had lived surrounded by people who wanted things from him, money, favors, connections, but no one had wanted to simply exist beside him in quiet. This woman didn't ask for anything, and that was why he wanted to give her everything he didn't know how to offer. Later that evening, the wind outside began to rise again, a reminder that the mountain wasn't done testing them. The power failed completely, plunging the resort into shadow. The only light came from the fire and the lanterns Alexander found in the supply closet. Clara sat by the hearth, wrapping Luna in an extra blanket. The child was already half asleep, thumb tucked beneath her chin. Alexander watched them, the soft curve of Clara's hair catching the firelight, and for the first time in 2 years, the weight on his chest didn't feel immovable. He sat across from her, the crackle of fire between them. She looked up and met his eyes. "You don't need to fix me," she said quietly. Her tone wasn't cold, only certain. He held her gaze. "Maybe I need to remember how to try." She shook her head, a small, almost sad smile on her lips. "You can't build someone out of what's broken in you." He leaned forward slightly. "Maybe not, but sometimes broken things fit together better than perfect ones." Her eyes softened. Maybe, she whispered, but fitting together isn't the same as being whole. The fire popped, sending sparks upward. Their faces glowed in its light, the air between them thick with something neither could name. They sat like that for a long time, two people carved out of loss and snow bound by a silence that said more than words ever could. Outside, the storm had quieted again, but inside something was shifting, slow, fragile, unstoppable. When Clara finally rose to carry Luna to the couch, Alexander stood as well. She paused beside him, the child's head resting against her shoulder, and for the briefest moment she let herself meet his eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. For what he asked, for not coming inside, she replied and walked away. He stood there long after she was gone, staring into the fire until it blurred. Maybe he thought sometimes staying outside was the only way to be invited in. Upstairs, he found the old guest book Elise used to keep at the front desk. Its pages were filled with messages from guests who had called this place paradise. He traced her handwriting, the loops and flourishes that used to make him smile, then wrote one line beneath it: "Winter never melts. It only waits for warmth." He closed the book, set it down, and listened to the faint sound of Clara's footsteps in the hall. For the first time since the crash, he let himself believe warmth might return. The morning after the storm broke with an unnatural stillness, the kind that came after nature had exhausted its fury. The world outside was dazzling and cruel, the sunlight scattering off the snow so brightly it hurt to look at. Clara stood at the window, with Luna perched on her hip, gazing at the untouched whiteness stretching across the valley. For the first time in weeks, she let herself believe they might be safe. Down below Alexander's SUV was half buried under snowdrifts, a monument to how completely the mountain had sealed them in. He was outside with a shovel, his breath visible, in the crisp air, each movement deliberate and focused. There was something grounding about watching him work. A man who could buy anything, yet chose to dig his own way out. Clara felt the thought before she could stop it. He didn't belong in her world, and she didn't belong in his. And yet here they were bound by isolation and chance. Luna tugged at her sweater. "Can we make snow angels when we go outside?" Clara kissed her forehead, smiling faintly. "Maybe soon, sweetheart, when the snow isn't so deep." She turned away from the window, trying to ignore the pang of guilt that came with every promise she made, because promises meant tomorrow, and tomorrow was a luxury they couldn't afford to believe in. When Alexander came back inside, his hair dusted white, she handed him a towel. "The driveway's buried all the way to the gate," he said. "It'll take a plow to clear it. No one's getting in or out until the county gets through." Clara nodded, though her pulse quickened. Being trapped had its comfort. No one could reach her, but also its terror. He studied her face. "You're afraid of something other than the storm, aren't you?" She looked down, unwilling to lie. "Storms don't follow you once they pass." He didn't press, just watched her for a long moment, before saying quietly, "Some do." By afternoon, the wind had returned, gentler now but sharp enough to bite through the stillness. Alexander was making tea in the kitchen when he caught a flicker of movement on the security feed. He froze, a dark shape at the edge of the property near the main gate. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but when he replayed the footage, he saw it clearly: tire tracks, fresh ones. He stepped outside the cold, slapping him awake, and followed the path to where the snow dipped slightly. A single set of tracks half filled with powder, leading toward the road. He crouched, touching the imprint. Not his. Someone had come up the road, stopped, then turned around. He stood slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing but silence. Yet the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. When he returned inside, Clara was sitting by the fire, reading to Luna. The moment he stepped in, she knew something had shifted. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tightening. "Tracks," he said simply. "Someone's been near the property." Her eyes darkened. How close, close enough. He saw the fear flicker across her face, the kind of fear that didn't come from imagination but memory. She set the book down carefully, her hands trembling. "We need to leave. The roads are blocked," he reminded her. "You'd freeze before you reached the next town." "Then I'll take my chances," she said, standing abruptly. Luna looked up, confused. Mama Alexander stepped between them and the door. "Running won't solve this." "You don't know who he is," she snapped. "You don't know what he's capable of. Then tell me." She hesitated, torn between pride and panic. "My ex-husband," she said finally. "He's a cop. At least he was. He knows how to find people, and he doesn't let go." Alexander absorbed this in silence. "Then you're not running anymore," he said. "Not from here. You can't stop him," she whispered. "He'll come, and when he does, you'll regret ever helping me." His eyes didn't waver. "Maybe. But I'd regret more if I let you face him alone." They stood like that tension, crackling between them like static, until Luna's small voice broke the silence. "Are we in trouble?" Clara turned to her daughter kneeling down. "No, baby, we're okay." The words trembled, but they were steady enough for a child to believe. When Clara looked back at Alexander, his expression had softened. "You can't keep running forever," he said quietly. "And you can't keep saving everyone," she replied. The line struck them both. He thought of the night of the crash, how he'd dragged Elise's body through the snow, calling her name long after he knew she couldn't answer. Saving her had become his purpose, failing her his punishment. He saw now that Clara carried her own version of the same curse. They were two survivors, clinging to opposite sides of the same wound. That night, the air felt heavier, charged with something unsaid. Clara packed a small bag quietly, while Luna slept, every movement slow, deliberate. She told herself she was doing the right thing, that leaving would protect them both. But when she reached the door, she found Alexander standing there blocking the way. "You really think walking into a blizzard will keep her safe?" he asked. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I can't let him find me here. You've already done too much." He shook his head. "Let me help you." She met his eyes, her own glistening. "Protection always comes with control," she said. "I've had enough of both." He stepped aside, pain flickering across his features. "Then at least wait until morning. The plows might reach the pass." She hesitated, torn. One night she agreed. No promises after that. Fair enough. He turned away, but before he could leave, a small sound stopped them both. "Daddy." The word came softly from the doorway. Luna stood there rubbing her eyes, her voice full of innocent certainty. "I had a bad dream," she said. "Can I sleep here?" Alexander froze. Clara went still, too stunned to speak. The little girl walked forward, wrapping her tiny arms around his leg, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You're warm," she murmured sleepily. For a long moment, no one moved. Alexander crouched down, slowly meeting the child's gaze. "I'm not your daddy, sweetheart," he said gently. "I know," she replied, simply resting her head against his shoulder. "But you feel like one." The words hit something deep inside him, a place he thought had long since turned to stone. When he looked up, Clara was watching, tears glinting in her eyes. "I'll stay," she whispered. "For now." The next morning the tracks were gone, swallowed by fresh snowfall. But in their place was something new, a fragile peace, a pause in the running, a space where trust could begin to take root. Alexander stood on the porch, staring at the endless white, and for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. Inside, Clara was humming softly to Luna, the melody carrying through the hall like the first hint of spring. He closed his eyes listening and felt something inside him shift. Maybe the tracks in the snow didn't always lead away. Sometimes they led home. The next days unfolded like fragile glass, quiet, reflective, and dangerous to touch. The storm had passed, but the mountain still held its breath. The roads remained closed, the sky pale as bone, and time seemed to stretch between them in delicate silences. Alexander began to change first. He still rose early, still carried that quiet authority that came from running empires, but there was something different now. He lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, learned how Clara liked her tea, how Luna always drew suns with 8 rays instead of 6. He started cooking breakfast, simple things like oatmeal and scrambled eggs, the kind of meals he hadn't made since his wife was alive. When Clara walked in, that morning still half asleep, she froze at the sight of him at the stove. "You cook?" she asked suspicion, softening into disbelief. "Used to," he said. "Turns out it's like flying, you don't really forget." She smiled faintly at the analogy, not realizing that every word he chose had ghosts behind it. By noon, the house felt almost like a home. Luna had discovered the piano in the lounge and was pressing the keys with delighted concentration. Alexander knelt beside her, showing her a few simple chords. Clara stood in the doorway, arms folded watching, as the little girl's laughter filled the empty space that had once been haunted by silence. The sound reached something buried in him, a reminder that life wasn't only what had been lost, but what could still be built. When Luna managed to play a simple melody, she looked up proudly. "Did I do it?" she asked. "You did," Alexander said softly. "You made music." And for the first time in years, so did he. Later that evening, as Clara folded laundry near the fire, Alexander sat across from her reading a message on his phone. His expression shifted, and she noticed the way his jaw tightened. "Bad news?" she asked. He hesitated, then set the phone down face down. "Just business," he said, though his tone betrayed the lie. "You don't strike me as the kind of man who worries about business," she replied quietly. He looked up, and their eyes met. Everyone worries about something, he said. She didn't ask again, but she saw it, the flicker of fear beneath the calm exterior. He was hiding something just as she was. That night, when she came downstairs for water, she found him in the study, sitting in the dark, illuminated only by the glow of his laptop. On the screen was a headline, "New Allegations in Hale Aviation, Tragedy Resurface." She froze. He didn't notice her at first, but when he did, he closed the laptop with slow precision. "You read it," she said softly. "It's nothing," he replied, "just the press doing what they do." But she could hear the weight in his voice, the fatigue of a man long accustomed to guilt. "They're accusing you," she said, "of flying drunk." He exhaled long and quiet. "It was a lie that stuck. My wife and I were supposed to land in Aspen that night. The storm came faster than forecasted. I made the wrong call." His voice faltered. She didn't make it out. Clara stood there for a long moment before saying, "You don't need to keep punishing yourself for surviving." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "Then what do I do with the rest of it?" "You live," she said simply. The conversation hung in the air, like mist, fragile and unfinished. The next day, Clara woke to find a small breakfast note by her door. "I'm driving into town to check the road conditions. Stay inside. A.H." But by afternoon, the snow had returned, and so had her worry. He didn't come back until dusk, his SUV splattered with mud and salt. When he stepped inside, she saw the fatigue in his posture and the tension in his face. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Mostly," he said. "Except for this." He handed her a folded envelope. Inside was a photo of her, taken from a distance, a grainy image of her walking with Luna in town weeks ago. Her blood ran cold. "Where did you get this?" "It was taped to the gate." He met her eyes. "He's closer than you thought." The realization hit her like a blow. She gripped the back of the chair to steady herself. "We need to leave," she said. "Now." Alexander shook his head. "Leaving won't help. He'll just follow your trail again." You need to face him with protection with the law." "The law," she laughed bitterly. "He is the law. Not here." Alexander said, voice low but steady. "This is my property, my rules." His words might have sounded arrogant in another man's mouth, but here they carried quiet resolve. Clara's defenses wavered. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You don't owe me anything." He looked at her eyes, dark and unreadable. "Maybe because someone once needed to be saved and I wasn't enough. Maybe this time I can be." The line unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't pity in his voice, it was recognition. That night, after Luna fell asleep, Clara found him outside, chopping firewood under the moonlight. His breath came in visible clouds, the sound of the axe rhythmic and sure. She stood in the doorway for a while before stepping out. "You don't have to play hero," she said. He didn't look up. "I'm not." "Then what are you doing?" "Building walls that keep the right people. In this time," he said quietly. The words lingered between them, heavy with meaning. She moved closer. "You don't have to fix me, Alexander. Maybe I'm not fixing you," he said, meeting her gaze. "Maybe I'm learning how to stop breaking things." Later, when they returned inside, he was the one to read Luna a bedtime story. His voice, deep and calm, carried through the small space, like warmth itself. Clara stood by the doorway, watching the man who'd built towers of glass and steel. Now kneeling on the floor beside a 5-year-old, his walls quietly collapsing one story at a time. When Luna drifted to sleep, he glanced up and caught Clara's gaze. "She trusts easily," he said. "She trusts because she's never seen." "Someone earn it the hard way," Clara replied. "Maybe it's time she does," he said, and she couldn't tell if he meant Luna or himself. Hours later, when the storm quieted again, Clara found herself unable to sleep. She went downstairs and found Alexander sitting by the fire, lost in thought. He looked up when she entered. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. He shook his head. "Sometimes the quiet's louder than the noise." She sat across from him, the firelight painting their faces in gold and shadow. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then softly she said, "You can stop pretending you don't care." He smiled faintly, eyes glinting. "And you can stop pretending you don't need anyone." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was fragile, hopeful, like the world before a thaw. Somewhere outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and slow, a reminder that even the coldest walls eventually melt. The mountains slept under a thin, deceptive peace that night. The sky was velvet black, the air sharp enough to taste. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, throwing restless shadows against the walls. Clara had just tucked Luna into bed, humming the same lullaby she'd sung since her daughter was born, the one she'd used to drown out the sounds of shouting and slamming doors in another life. But tonight the melody faltered, interrupted by something she couldn't name. A prickle at the back of her neck, an unease that wouldn't settle. Downstairs, Alexander was locking up for the night. He checked the doors, the windows, the alarm system. It had become routine, almost obsessive, ever since the photo appeared at the gate. He had tripled the security around the resort, but he knew that some threats didn't announce themselves until they were already inside. He turned off the last light, glanced out through the glass wall that faced the driveway and froze. Headlights. A pair of them cutting through the darkness like eyes. A vehicle was moving up the private road, slow but steady, its engine rumbling low beneath the wind. It was far too late for guests, far too deliberate to be lost travelers. He moved quickly, shutting the curtains before the lights could sweep across the living room. Upstairs, he heard Clara's footsteps. "Alexander," she called softly, sensing the shift in the air. He met her at the landing, his face calm but his eyes alert. "Go back upstairs," he said. "Take Luna, lock the door. What's happening? Someone's here." Her breath caught. "He found us." He didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Call the sheriff," she said, voice shaking. "Already did." He pressed a button on his phone, triggering the resort's emergency protocol. "They'll take 20 minutes, maybe more." "That's too long," she whispered. "Then we make it long enough," he replied. Outside, the SUV came to a stop. The headlights died, plunging the forest into shadow. The only sound was the crunch of boots on snow. Alexander moved to the gun safe, hidden behind a cabinet. His movements precise, practiced. He wasn't a man of violence by nature, but life had taught him that survival sometimes demanded a steadier hand. He loaded a small handgun, checked the chamber, then turned to her. "If anything happens, you run," he said. "No," Clara said sharply. "I'm not leaving you here. You're not staying for me," he said, his voice low. "You're staying for her. You get her out. Understand?" Before she could answer, a heavy knock echoed through the door, 3 slow, deliberate pounds that rattled the hinges. "Clara," a man's voice called, deep, controlled, and terrifyingly familiar. "You can open the door, sweetheart. It's cold out here." Her blood turned to ice. "It's him," she breathed. "Stay quiet," Alexander said. He moved to the side of the doorway, positioning himself in the blind spot. The knocking came again, louder. "You think I can't tell when you're in there?" The voice sneered. "I can see the light in the window." Clara clutched the banister, trembling. "Evan, please just go," she called despite herself. "You don't need to do this. Don't need to." His laugh was sharp and ugly. "You took my kid, Clara. You ran off like some goddamn saint and made me look like the monster. You know how that makes a man look in his own precinct." The door shook as he slammed a fist against it. "Open it before I break it." Alexander stepped forward, voice cold and even. "You need to leave." Silence. Then a low chuckle. "You must be the rich boy she's hiding behind." The doorknob rattled violently. "You think money means anything to a man like me? It means you'll lose more than you came for," Alexander replied. His tone was calm, but his hand tightened on the weapon. There was a pause, then the sound of retreating footsteps crunching over snow. For a heartbeat, Clara thought he might actually be leaving. Then glass shattered. The side window exploded, inward shards scattering across the floor. Evan stepped through, gun drawn. His face twisted with fury and triumph. "You should have stayed out of this," he growled at Alexander. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "A coward," Alexander said evenly. "Who brings a gun to a home with a child inside." Evan's eyes narrowed. "Where is she?" He turned toward the staircase. "Luna," he shouted, the sound splitting the night. Clara lunged instinctively, stepping between him and the stairs. "Don't you dare say her name," she cried. He sneered. "Still pretending you're the good one, huh? After everything you did, what I did," she spat, "was survive." He raised his gun, and Alexander fired first. The shot cracked through the cabin, deafening, echoing off the walls. Evan stumbled backward, the bullet grazing his shoulder. "You son of a—" He fired back wildly, shattering a lamp, a mirror, anything that caught the light. Alexander ducked behind the counter, grabbing Clara's wrist and pulling her down with him. "Stay down," he hissed. Her ears rang her heart, pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Above them, Luna screamed. That single sound cut through every layer of fear. Clara bolted up, ready to run to her daughter, but Alexander caught her arm. "He'll use her against you," he warned. "Then he'll have to go through me first," she said. He looked at her, saw the mother's fire blazing in her eyes, and something in him shifted. "Then we go together," he said. They moved up the stairs in sync, her behind him, his weapon raised. Evan's voice echoed from the hall. "You're making this worse for yourself, Clara. You know how this ends." "Yes," Alexander said from behind the wall. "It ends with you in cuffs." Evan fired again. The bullet tore through the drywall inches from Alexander's head. The smell of gunpowder mixed with pine and smoke. Clara slipped into Luna's room, whispering her daughter's name. The little girl was under the bed, sobbing quietly. "Mama," she gasped, reaching out. "It's okay, baby," Clara whispered, gathering her up, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "It's okay, we're almost done." Alexander stepped out from cover, voice steady. "Evan, it's over. The sheriff's on his way. You've got maybe 5 minutes before this whole mountain swarms with deputies." "You think I care?" Evan snarled. "I've already lost everything. Might as well finish the job." His boots crunched closer. Clara's pulse thundered. She could see his shadow stretch across the doorway, long and warped. He lifted the gun. And then sirens, faint at first, then growing, slicing through the wind. Evan hesitated, the moment breaking. Alexander saw it and moved, kicking the gun from his hand. It skidded across the floor. The two men collided, the struggle, brutal and silent, except for the sound of fists and shattering glass. Clara ran to grab Luna's blanket, wrapping it around her daughter's head to block the noise. When the door burst open, moments later, red and blue lights flashed through the storm. Deputies stormed the entryway, shouting orders. "Drop it!" Hands up, Alexander stepped back, breathing hard blood on his lip. Evan lay on the floor, cursing, his arm twisted behind his back as they cuffed him. The sheriff glanced around, taking in the wreckage, the broken glass, the overturned furniture, the trembling woman clutching her child. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked. Clara nodded numbly. "We're fine." Her voice cracked on the word. The deputies hauled Evan to his feet. He looked at her one last time, his expression full of hate and something like disbelief. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You'll always be mine?" Clara stared at him, her eyes burning but steady. "No," she said softly, "not anymore." When they were gone, the silence felt almost unreal. The wind outside had softened, as if the mountain itself exhaled. Alexander leaned against the wall, exhaustion seeping through his bones. Clara moved to him, her hands shaking as she reached for his face. "You could have been killed," she whispered. He met her gaze, his voice rough. "So could you." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she said, "You shouldn't have done that for me." "It wasn't just for you," he said. "It was for her, for me, for all the times I didn't." Luna stirred in her arms, murmuring sleepily. Clara kissed her hair, tears spilling freely now. "It's over," she said, as if saying it would make it true. Alexander glanced at the shattered window, the flicker of police lights fading through the snow. "Maybe," he said, "but something tells me it's only beginning." The sheriff returned a moment later. "We'll need your statements in the morning," he said. "You're safe for now. We'll post a patrol through the night." Clara nodded in gratitude. When the door closed behind them, she turned back to Alexander. "You didn't have to stay," she said. "I couldn't have left," he replied. Outside, the sirens faded into the distance. Inside, only the soft sound of the fire remained. Clara sank to her knees beside Luna's bed, pressing her forehead to her daughter's hand. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was running. For the first time, she believed she could stop. Alexander watched her, his own heart unsteady. In her eyes, he saw something he hadn't dared to feel since before the crash, purpose belonging a reason to stay. When Clara finally looked up, her voice was a whisper. "Thank you." He shook his head. "You don't owe me that." "Then let me say it anyway." He reached out, brushed the back of his fingers against her cheek, and she didn't flinch this time. The firelight caught her eyes, turning them molten alive. "You're safe now," he said softly. "Sleep." She nodded, holding Luna close as she lay down beside her daughter. Within minutes, she drifted off, her breathing steady and deep. Alexander stayed awake until dawn, watching the snow fall beyond the broken window. The storm had passed again, but something new had taken root, a quiet between them that wasn't empty anymore. It was the sound of survival of two people who had found each other in the wreckage and decided, maybe for the first time, not to look away. By morning, the snow had turned to sleet, washing away the footprints, the blood, the chaos of the night before. The resort looked almost serene again, as if pretending nothing had happened. But inside, the air was heavy with the residue of fear. Clara sat at the kitchen table, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. Luna was still asleep upstairs, watched over by Martha from the sheriff's office, who had insisted the child not wake to more flashing lights. Alexander stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, his expression carved from stone. "Yes," he said, finally voice clipped. "Make a statement, keep it short, no comment on the woman or the child." He hung up and exhaled slowly. Clara's eyes lifted toward him. "They know, don't they?" she asked quietly. "The press." He didn't answer right away. "They were outside the gate before sunrise," he said. "Someone leaked it. Probably a deputy looking to sell a story." Billionaire and single mother under attack in snowed-in mountain resort. It's already on 3 networks. She winced as if struck. "So now I'm a scandal." Now he said, his gaze steady. "You're a target again." But this time in headlines instead of crosshairs. She looked away, jaw tight. "Maybe it's better if we leave. The last thing you need is my name next to yours. It's not your name I'm worried about." He said, his tone low, careful. "It's your safety." "Safety." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "There's no safety in being a woman whose ex-husband's a cop. No safety in being poor or running, or in accepting help from a man like you. There's just waiting for the next hit." Her words cut, but not out of cruelty, out of exhaustion. Alexander didn't argue. He turned to the window, the reflection of his own face, ghostly in the glass. "The world will turn this into something it's not," he said finally. "They'll say I hid you here, that you were my lover, that the fight last night was over, jealousy, or money, or because. That's what people believe about men like you," she interrupted. "That power only reaches out when it wants to take something." He turned back to her, and for the first time she saw the flicker of pain beneath his composure. "Then maybe it's time I tell them what power looks like, when it tries to save instead." The following afternoon, a convoy of news vans and black sedans wound up the mountain road. Reporters swarmed at the resort's gates, their breath clouding in the cold as microphones waved in the air. The story had exploded, trending across every platform, every morning talk show. Hale's hidden affair, runaway mother and the mountain billionaire, violence, wealth, and secrets in the snow. Alexander's PR team had begged him to stay quiet, to let the story die down. But silence had cost him once before, and he refused to repeat the mistake. So when the cameras gathered in front of the lodge, he stepped outside. He looked immaculate despite the sleepless night, a navy coat, black gloves, his hair damp from melting snow. The world saw the billionaire. Only Clara knew the man behind the mask. Reporters shouted questions over one another, flashes bursting like gunfire. "Mr. Hale, were you harboring a fugitive? Did you have a relationship with Mrs. Jennings? Is it true the intruder was shot on your property?" Alexander raised a hand and the noise dimmed to a tense hum. There was no affair. He began, his voice clear, even. There was no scandal. There was only a woman trying to keep her daughter safe from a man who had hurt them both. "I gave them shelter, that's all," someone shouted. "Why risk your reputation for her?" He paused, and then slowly he said the words that would circle the internet within the hour. "Because the only thing I'm guilty of is trying to save someone the way I couldn't save my wife." The silence that followed was absolute. The wind caught his coat, the snow swirling around him like ash. "We live in a world where money can fix almost anything," he continued, "but it can't fix grief. It can't fix guilt. It can't bring back the people you've lost. What it can do, what we can do, is make sure we don't keep repeating the same failures. So yes, I opened my doors to a stranger. I'd do it again." With that, he turned and walked back inside, leaving the cameras to chase their own reflection. Clara had watched everything from the upstairs window. She hadn't expected to cry, but she did not out of shame or fear this time, but something else. It was the way he spoke her pain aloud, the way he turned her humiliation into humanity. She went downstairs as he returned, snow still clinging to his coat. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I did," he replied, "because if I didn't, they'd destroy you. And I'm tired of watching the world destroy good people while men like me stand by and let it happen." She shook her head. "They'll twist it anyway. They always do." "Then let them try," he said quietly. "Let them see what decency looks like when it refuses to apologize." Days passed and the noise began to fade. The sheriff filed the final report. Evan's bail was denied. The tabloids moved on to newer scandals, but something else had shifted. 2 letters began to arrive at the resort. Not threats this time, but thank yous. From women in shelters, from fathers raising children alone. From strangers who said his words had reminded them that not every man in power did to harm. Clara found one envelope addressed to her. Inside was a single line written in neat looping handwriting. "Because you let him help you, the rest of us saw it was possible." She read it 3 times, her throat tight. That evening she found Alexander outside near the stables repairing a broken fence post. "You could hire someone to do that," she said softly. He looked up, wiping his hands. "I could, but then I'd miss the quiet." "You know," she said, stepping closer, "quiet doesn't always mean peace." He smiled faintly. "I know, but it's the first step." They stood in silence for a while, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, the snow catching fire in the light. "You could still leave," he said finally. "Start fresh somewhere else. No more headlines, no more ghosts." She turned toward him, her expression calm but certain. "And what would I be running from this time, kindness?" He held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "You didn't break my life, Clara," he said softly. "You reminded me it wasn't over." That night when Luna fell asleep by the fire, Clara sat beside Alexander on the couch. The news had already begun to spin his press statement as a redemption arc, the billionaire who chose humanity. But none of that mattered here. Here it was, just the two of them, a flickering fire and the sound of wind brushing against the windows. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. He turned to her. "Now," he said, "we build something out of what's left." Together, she asked, almost afraid of the answer. His hand found hers. "Only if you'll let me come inside this time." She smiled through the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You already did." Outside, the storm clouds began to lift, revealing the faint promise of stars. The rumors would fade. The world would move on. But the redemption, the kind that came not from headlines, but from forgiveness, had already begun. Spring came slowly to the mountains, as if the earth itself were cautious about believing in gentler days. The snow receded in thin, uneven ribbons, revealing patches of green that looked almost too fragile to be real. The lake that had been frozen solid all winter began to thaw from the edges inward, rippling with new life. The Hale Ridge Resort reopened quietly that April, its polished glass and cedar beams reflecting the morning light. Guests began to trickle in, travelers, riders, couples seeking solitude. But behind the scenes, something new was being built, something deeper than business. Alexander called it the Hale Haven Project, a foundation to provide refuge and retraining for women and children escaping abuse. He had poured his fortune into it without hesitation. But it wasn't just philanthropy, it was penance, purpose, and hope intertwined. Clara stood beside him on the ridge overlooking the valley as workers assembled the final cabins. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "peaceful even." He nodded, the sunlight catching the silver thread at his temple. "It's not finished yet," he said. "It's just beginning." "Like us?" she asked with a faint smile. He turned to her, his expression gentle but steady. "Exactly like us." The air smelled of thawing pine and rain. Below the resort, shimmered against the retreating snow, a symbol of survival turned sanctuary. Clara had taken on the role of manager for the Haven program, though she still sometimes hesitated to see herself as anything more than a guest who had overstayed her welcome. But the staff respected her, admired her quiet strength, her kindness with the women who arrived nervous, and bruised her ability to make them feel seen without being exposed. She had learned to walk through the halls without fear. She had learned to smile again without apology. And somewhere along the way, she had stopped looking over her shoulder. One afternoon, as she sorted paperwork by the wide cabin window, Luna burst in from the playground, outside, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Mommy, come see," she exclaimed. The lake's moving again. Clara followed her outside, laughing. The ice had fully broken now, the water glittering like molten glass under the sun. "It's like it's breathing," Luna said, awed. "It is," Clara replied. "Everything's waking up." They stood side by side, and for a moment Clara's eyes drifted toward the main lodge, where Alexander was speaking with an architect. He caught her gaze, and even from a distance, the connection felt immediate, unspoken, like a language they had invented between them. That evening, as the last workers packed up, she found him still on the deck, hands resting on the railing, eyes fixed on the fading light. "You never stop," she said softly, stepping beside him. You'd think after building empires you'd know how to rest. This one's different, he said, smiling faintly. This one matters. The others didn't. They made money. This one makes sense. She studied him for a long moment, the wind playing with strands of her hair. You're different too. You make it sound like a compliment. It is. He turned to her fully, then the quiet intensity in his gaze, still capable of undoing her breath. When I met you, he said you wouldn't let me inside. Now look at us. She laughed softly. You still remember that every word he said, every wall. She looked out at the lake. And yet here you are. You waited for me to open the door, he said, his voice low, deliberate. I didn't force it. That's the difference. And that's why I let you in, she replied. The quiet stretched between them, warm and full. Then she reached into her pocket and handed him an envelope, old weathered, addressed in looping handwriting. What's this? He asked. Something the postmaster found last week. It was stuck in a mailbag from years ago. It's from your wife. His fingers tightened around it, the breath leaving his lungs for a moment. He hesitated before opening it. Inside the ink was faded but legible. Alex, it began. If you're reading this, it means you outlived the storm, and I'm glad. Don't make my death your punishment. Find someone who reminds you that you're still alive. Don't just exist, love again. He folded the letter carefully, his throat tight. She knew he murmured. Clara placed her hand over his. Maybe she did. Maybe she wanted you to find peace. I don't think she meant peace, he said softly. I think she meant this. His eyes met hers, and she saw the truth in them, the grief, the forgiveness, and the love that had grown in the spaces between. That night, a celebration was held to mark the official launch of Hale Haven. The main hall was filled with candles and laughter, with the sound of piano keys and clinking glasses. Local reporters came, but for once no one asked about scandals or redemption arcs. They asked about change, about rebuilding. Alexander stood before the crowd, Clara beside him, and spoke simply. This place was built from loss, but it stands for beginnings. For everyone who has ever been told to hide, this is where you're seen. For everyone who's been told they can't start over, this is where you do. When he finished, the applause was quiet, but powerful. Clara looked up at him, eyes shining with pride, and he turned toward her with a look that said more than any speech. After the guests left and the night settled, they walked down to the lake. The moonlight traced the ripples across the water, silver and soft. You said don't come inside, he said, smiling faintly. And you didn't, she replied, returning the smile. You waited. I'd wait forever for that door to open, he said. She stepped closer. Good thing you didn't have to. Their lips met, then not as rescue or desperation, but as something quiet and whole, like the moment after a storm when the world remembers how to breathe. When they pulled apart, the air between them was filled with the scent of pine and melted snow. So what now, she asked. Now we live, he said. No running, no fixing, just living. She nodded her hand, finding his fingers intertwining naturally, like they had been waiting for this shape all along. They stood that way for a long time, the stars reflecting in the lake, the mountains standing like witnesses. Back at the lodge, Luna's laughter drifted faintly from her room upstairs, blending with the soft hum of music from the hall. Clara looked up toward the sound, her heart full. You built all of this, she said. No, Alexander corrected gently. We did. She rested her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing. "You know what I love most about the snow melting," she whispered. "What it means, everything that was buried gets a second chance to grow." He smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Then I guess we're spring." The camera of memory would have lingered there, the light on their faces, the reflection of stars in the lake, the subtle promise of warmth after so much cold. The snow had melted, the storm had passed, and for the first time in a long time, they weren't surviving anymore. They were home. A full year passed before the mountains saw snow again. This time it came softly, no blizzards, no howling winds. Just a quiet white veil that settled over the pines and rooftops like a benediction. The Hale Ridge Resort thrived not as a symbol of wealth, but as a place where broken stories were mended. Guests came and went, but some stayed. Women rebuilding their lives, children learning how to laugh again, men volunteering to teach carpentry cooking or how to start over. What had begun as a shelter had become something sacred, a living testament to the idea that safety could be built from ruin. Clara stood on the porch of the main lodge, bundled in a thick wool coat, her breath visible in the morning light. The smell of wood smoke drifted through the air, mingling with the sound of Luna's laughter, as the little girl ran across the courtyard, chasing a snowflake that refused to land. Behind her, Alexander emerged from the workshop, his sleeves rolled up, a few streaks of sawdust on his shirt. He was smiling in that quiet way of his, the smile that carried both peace and memory. "You're supposed to be taking it easy," Clara said, teasing as she joined him. "Doctor's orders." "I am," he said, pretending to stretch his shoulder. "Turns out building furniture is easier than running an empire. And far more useful," she said, bumping his arm, "especially since Luna wants a dollhouse by Christmas." "Already halfway done," he replied, eyes twinkling. "You think I'd miss my daughter's first real Christmas here?" The word slipped out so naturally she almost didn't notice. My daughter, and yet it fit perfectly, like it had always belonged to him. She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "She's lucky to have you," Clara said softly. "I'm lucky she lets me," he replied. Later that afternoon, as the first guests arrived for the holiday celebration, Clara watched Luna show off the ornaments she had made from pine cones and ribbons. Music played faintly from the dining hall, and the smell of cinnamon and cider filled the air. The warmth of it all made Clara's throat tighten. A year ago, this same mountain had felt like a prison. Now it was the heartbeat of her life. Alexander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You're quiet," he murmured. "Just thinking," she said. "About what?" "About how sometimes the things that break you the worst lead you exactly where you were meant to go." He kissed her hair, his breath warm against her ear. "Then I'm grateful for every broken thing." As evening fell, the resort glowed with light. Guests gathered by the fire trading stories and laughter, while snow drifted past the windows. Luna was curled on Alexander's lap, asleep, her small hand clutching his thumb. Clara sat across from them, watching the man who had once been frozen in grief, now a picture of gentleness, the little girl who had once hidden under beds, now safe enough to dream in open spaces. It struck her how healing didn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it came quietly, like snow falling or hands finding each other in the dark. After putting Luna to bed, Clara returned to the living room. The fire had burned low, casting long golden shadows. On the mantel sat a framed letter, the one from Alexander's late wife. its edges yellowed, but its message eternal. Next to it was a new photo, the three of them standing outside the cabin, in spring sunlight caught in their hair, the lake shimmering behind them. She reached out, tracing the glass. "You kept it," she said softly. "It reminds me," he said, "that love doesn't replace love, it grows beside it." She turned toward him, her eyes shining. "And this?" she asked, resting a hand on her stomach, her expression both playful and tender. His breath caught. "You're sure?" She nodded, smiling through tears. "Looks like spring's coming early again." He pulled her close, laughter and disbelief mingling in his voice. "Home," he whispered against her hair. "Finally." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the mountain in silence. The same ridge that had once been a place of hiding now echoed with warmth, with laughter, with the hum of new beginnings. Inside, the fire glowed steady, throwing light across the wooden floors, where a child's toy lay forgotten. A half-carved cradle waited by the hearth, and two people who had once sworn they were beyond repair now stood whole. Later that night, long after the guests had gone to bed and the resort was quiet, Alexander sat at his desk with a pen in hand. The letter he wrote was short, but it carried the weight of everything he had learned. "Dear Elise," it began, "you'd be glad to know I finally came inside." He folded the page carefully and placed it beside the photo on the mantel. Then he turned to look at Clara, sleeping on the couch, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly, the firelight painting her in gold. He thought of all the storms they had weathered, all the doors that had once been closed, and how somehow every path had led to this moment. The sound of wind outside was soft now, like a lullaby. He closed his eyes and listened to the rhythm of home, the quiet crackle of fire, the faint stir of snow, the steady heartbeat of the woman he loved and knew that for the first time in his life, the world had stopped asking for penance. It was offering peace. If this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you that love can still grow in the coldest places, that even the most broken hearts can find their way home, then don't scroll away just yet. Take a deep breath and stay with me for a moment. Imagine standing at that window with Clara, watching the snow melt after a long, brutal winter, feeling the warmth of someone's hand, finding yours, and realizing that maybe, just maybe, you don't have to carry it all alone anymore. That's what this story was always about. Not wealth or rescue or fairy tale perfection, but the quiet, breathtaking moment when two people finally stop running from their pain and start walking toward healing together. Because love, the real kind, doesn't come to save you. It comes to see you exactly where you are. If you felt that if Alexander's strength, or Clara's courage, or little Luna's laughter found a way into your heart, then let's keep this feeling alive. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you've ever had a storm you thought you'd never survive, or if someone unexpected became your safe place when you least believed in home. I read every word, and I promise your stories matter here. And if this one gave you hope, even a flicker, then share it with someone who's rebuilding, with someone who needs to remember that second chances aren't miracles, they're choices. Every like, every share, every comment is more than engagement. It's a small act of connection, a way of saying I understand. Because somewhere out there, someone else is standing in their own blizzard, waiting for a hand to reach through the cold. So let's keep reaching. Let's fill the quiet corners of the internet with warmth again, with stories that don't just entertain, they heal. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Not just for the next chapter, but to be part of something that believes love still matters, that softness is still strength, that beginnings can rise even from ashes. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and remember, the door to your own peace is still there, waiting for you to open it. You just have to let the light in.